I also want to bring us some thoughts up to date on where Scotland might be in relation to the European Union. My views on the development of the European Union have in fact changed over time. Sometimes I've been right, and on occasions I have actually been wrong, not seeing some developments actually coming as they have, in fact developed. But there's always been two principles to which I've adhered to. One is that you have to have the maximum amount of sovereignty if in Scotland we are to tackle the fundamental problems that face our people. We are a 5 million population, and yet there was a statistic during the referendum that 1 million out of that 5 million are living in poverty. And it's how to tackle that. I believe you have to have the maximum sovereignty. And the other principle is that I have always been opposed to the creation of a superstate in Europe. And not in one form. I don't object to the European Union being a trading, commercial superstate. I have fundamental objections to it trying to become a superstate that can project power upon the rest of the world. And I remember a chap called Standring, because when I worked with the Arab British Chamber of Commerce, I organised and often led delegations from the Arab private sector to Brussels. And I can remember this guy Standring, who was a senior official, telling me at that time that we had to have a United States of Europe. It had to have not only political but military power in order to balance what was then the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And that particular theme actually has never died within the intellectual elite in Brussels. I began, the first time I ever heard of the EEC, as it was then called, was at a fire brigade school in Sheffield in 1962. I mean, I had been in the Royal Navy, and I must tell you that when you're in the forces like that, you're hermetically sealed. I was thinking today, did I ever read a newspaper? Not while I was on board HMS Salisbury. I never read a newspaper. I mean, what mattered was going ashore and all the rest of it. And I only began to read newspapers when I was in the Navy when I got to Hong Kong. And a number of us started, talking about socialism. So the first time I heard of it, 1962, this guy called Beavis came along, very, very pro EEC, and myself and the others in the room didn't like what he said. To be fair to the Fire Brigade Union, their whole purpose in political education was to make us think. Ordinary members of the FBU, to make us think and realise there were other points of view beyond the ones that we particularly held. But I didn't like the idea of the loss of sovereignty. It didn't really matter until, from my point of view anyway, until I got into Parliament in 1970. And the drive came from the Heath government to take us into the European community. I gave a lot of thought at that time. And at the beginning, when we were sort of debating it, my view was coloured by my attachment to the Commonwealth. My generation in the Labour Party, we had been members of the movement for colonial freedom. And so we saw the Commonwealth as an extremely important extension of the ideas which we thought would help conquer the world. And I saw the EEC, I knew perfectly well that we'd be turning away from the Commonwealth, centralising ourselves on Europe, which would be the first time in British history that they'd ever done that, attached themselves umbilically to the European continent. I gave it a lot of thought, and that was the reason why I was opposed to the EEC. Well, we went in, and then I was part of the Labour Party parliamentary group, which was heading towards the referendum in 1975. I campaigned on the no entry, come back out. in 1975. But in the debates that took place, that was when I first began to talk about Scottish independence in Europe. On the 4th of February 1975, in a debate, I was still a member of the Labour Party, I said if we are locked inside the EEC, I would not argue that Scotland should come out. That is perhaps some comfort to my honourable friend, the member for West Lothian, Tam. I believe that we should retain our close links with other people inside the British Isles, but I would certainly argue that it would then be in the interests of the Scottish people to have direct nation-state membership of the community. If we were foolish enough to continue inside the EEC, it might be time to write a new verse to an old song. Well, we, on my side, lost the referendum. And I thought it was so obvious. I was absolutely certain that the SNP would leap into what I saw as a vacuum, and that they would come out for independence in Europe. So I already had a memo prepared, and I held a press conference in which, I stated the point of view. If I can quote from it: "No party has yet opted for independent Scottish representation. The SNP are essentially separatist, but in the months and years ahead, they will be under great pressure to change their separatist ambition to the more realistic line of involvement in the EEC through independent representation." It was very interesting. I had this press conference, and the guys who were there, and they were all very, very able journalists, didn't know what I was talking about. I might as well have been talking in Swahili. Absolutely evident they hadn't a clue. I went down to Parliament that afternoon after the press conference and discovered that nobody else had a clue as to what I was talking about. A number of years later, when I managed to persuade the SNP on independence in Europe, I held another press conference, and it was more or less the same people who turned up who told me, "Geez, that's a brilliant idea." That was a lesson I learned. You can be far ahead of your time, but I've never regretted, putting down, that particular sort of marker that was there. That referendum is actually quite instructive if you care to go back and look at what both the Heath government and the Wilson government told people. It was actually laced with lies. 1969, before Heath was elected, the Werner Report was published in Brussels. And the Werner Report talked about economic and monetary union and a single currency. But it died a death. Europe, he was ahead of his time as well. Europe wasn't particularly used to that. The 75 referendum is very interesting for what they actually said. This was in the leaflet sent to every house by the Wilson government. "No important new policy can be decided in Brussels or anywhere else without the consent of a British minister answerable to a British government and a British Parliament. It is the Council of Ministers and not the market's officials who take the important decisions. These decisions can be taken only if all members of the Council agree. The Minister representing Britain can veto any proposal for a new law or new tax if he considered it to be against the British interests. Ministers from other governments have the same right of veto. Remember, all the countries in the market today enjoy, like us, democratically elected governments answerable to their own parliaments and their own voters. They do not want to weaken their parliaments any more than we would. Well, folk like me in 1975 said, you better look at the Treaty of Rome. You know, the Treaty of Rome is quite clear, there's a certain direction that they wish to travel in, and we were told we were scaremongering. Well, in we went. And from my point of view, that was it. We were in. I couldn't see any possibility of us ever being able, either in the UK level or in the Scottish level, being able to come out, because the EEC was in fact developing. In 1986, by then I was a member of the SNP. It went to a vote at conference, independence in Europe, won by a margin of 8-1. So that was the party committed. In 1988, and this is it, I think it's really of some interest. There is now underway one of the great shifts in world economic power and influence. Most were unaware of it in the 1960s and 1970s, but it is unmistakable in the 1980s. We are heading for the century of the Pacific, and this is underlined by the fact that consistently over these past few years, the United States has done more trade with Pacific countries than with Europe. That did not happen before. On the Pacific rim of Southeast Asia, the economic growth in some countries is of the order of 8 to 11% a year. We have entered the technological era in which people with intellectual power, energy and drive are the vital resource that fuels growth. Whereas Europe has an ageing population whose energy is waning, the countries on the Pacific Rim have a high proportion of young people able to seize the opportunities offered by the new technologies. That does not mean that all is lost for Europe. Our relative position will change, but we still have built-in advantages of technical traditions and political stability, with benefits still to be had from the creation of a single market. Europe is not heading for an economic abyss, but it does face new world challenges to its industry, its economic strength relative to others, and as a consequence, its political influence in world affairs. The great sea change in economic power distribution to which I refer cannot be reversed. Indeed, it should be welcomed by internationalists, because a world more evenly balanced in terms of economic power is likely to be a more stable one politically. I was wrong on that. We should also be happy to see peoples who have been traditionally poor and exploited, creating an indigenous strength, reaching new levels of independence and growing prosperity. Again, I found myself ahead of my time, because in the election of 1992, in a very large gathering, about 700 people, at a public meeting in Pennylee in Govan constituency, we were asked a question on economics, and I got up and explained about the coming century of the Pacific, the ageing of the European population, the development of technology, and the challenges it would in fact pose to us given these changed circumstances, and I could tell that the audience actually didn't like it. One of the, just as an aside, one of the interesting things I've found in my political life is that people keep telling us the public like the truth. I've discovered they like the truth that they like, not necessarily the truth that they don't like. And there was me giving a sort of mini seminar on what was going to happen. And Ian Davidson, who got up with my opponent, said, "It's all right, listening to Jim and his Century of the Pacific, what we need is a Labour government on Thursday," to wild applause. And this was the magic pill as opposed to an analysis. I was out of Parliament, and I was working at the Arab British Chamber, and by 1991, the European Union was beginning to develop. It had a period, and people forget this, of utter paralysis for a very long time. Nothing happened. It used devices like stopping the clock. Now, a lot of the young people in here will not know about this, but older folk will. They had to get a particular issue passed at midnight on a certain day, and they couldn't. So they stopped the clock at 10 to 12. And the clock stopped for 2 or 3 months until they resolved it, and then, said, well, that's it, the clock started again. And it has to be understood, Brussels is very adept, and I'll come to this when I come to our independence in the EU, very adept at finding the political solution to what seems to be a very difficult problem. I mean, earlier than that, in the 1960s, you had what was called the Luxembourg Accord. The original 6 had to pass everything unanimously. And de Gaulle found that France very often was in a minority of 1. And he wasn't having 5-1 under any circumstances. So France actually practiced the empty chair. So there was only 5 and you needed 60 votes, so the community couldn't do anything. They then had a meeting, which wasn't a treaty, they had a meeting and came to the political solution called the Luxembourg Accord, which said among the 6, if there's something that really bugs one government, then we won't pursue it, basically. And de Gaulle, filled the chair again. So the people in Brussels actually have a history of being able to make the necessary political adjustments if they are in fact required to do so. But by 1991, I'm having a look at how this organisation is developing, and I don't really like the way it's going. There are forces seeking to fashion the community as a federal United States of Europe, with a central superior parliament making laws and a powerful central government able to dictate policy. The states would no longer be sovereign in international law, becoming instead weak subordinates of the strong centre, the US model. That is the nightmare of the Bruges Group. They should rest easy, because that kind of EC is pie that will never fall from the sky. Just how wrong was I in 1991? And I said, for example, the smaller states, they would have to take leave of their senses to swap their present equality and their international sovereign persona for a subservient role. I had spotted where it was going, or where the elite in Brussels would like to take it, but I didn't believe that anybody in the States, membership of the organisation, would agree to travel in that direction. And I was very, very wrong as far as that was concerned. By 2000, I thought it was time. I had lots of time in my hands down in London. I wrote another pamphlet. The days of pamphleteering seem to be over in politics. My generation, George Younger, Michael Forsyth and company, we actually did, produce pamphlets. But I had a look, and this was in 2000, and this was when, the euro, the single currency, and the drive towards this United States of Europe was well underway. The single currency with its implications is the greatest issue to face the peoples of the United Kingdom and Europe since 1945. It requires more than a Scottish approach. And much of the pamphlet was devoted to a contribution on general principles to the European debate on a single currency. I take a different approach from many other people. My opposition is based on wider considerations. I believe the ultimate objective of the Euro's architects, a federal state, will do serious long-term damage, not only to the UK and Scotland, but to the political and economic stability of all the member states. I sort of saw what was in fact likely to happen. And at that time, I denounced the Commission and Company as a purblind elite who were determined on a course of action irrespective of what the peoples in Europe thought at that particular time. And I thought the drive towards this unified, single, sovereign entity was a profound mistake. One reason being that we in Europe lack the political homogeneity to form a United States of Europe. I mean, there are quite substantial political differences in terms of history and practices, as well as some cultural ones which are not as important as the political ones between the various states that make up the European Union. I discovered when I was going to Brussels with these delegations that this elite actually were a class on their own. I didn't find anywhere, talking in general to them, any idea that they had to have democratic legitimacy for what it was they were trying to do, which was to create a United States of Europe. And this came in all of its sort of awful, undemocratic guise when they produced a constitution whose aim was big step one to this United States of Europe as a separate sovereign entity. And it was rejected by the French and the Dutch in their referendum, so it couldn't go forward. What that elite then did was just change a few words and call it not the Constitution, but the Lisbon Treaty. And there's actually, people are on the record as admitting this. All we did was change a few words because we were determined to get this through. And so we have the Lisbon Treaty, and we have the euro. And we're now in a very strange position where the European Union has legality as an organisation in international law, which it didn't have before Lisbon. It can sign treaties, for example. So we have this sort of hybrid that we're living in at the present time, where the UK will claim it's sovereign, but in Brussels they will claim sovereignty over very, very large parts of policy. And one of the fallacies that has been purveyed to European populations is that all we are doing is sharing sovereignty. We are not. From the very beginning, we have transferred sovereignty. And what the Lisbon Treaty brought out very clearly, we had transferred so much sovereignty that a new sovereign had appeared in the international community. That elite is purblind. I mean, I know a great deal about Portugal, and the development of the euro, and one of my pamphlets, I made it perfectly plain, was in fact a disaster, because you couldn't possibly have one policy fits all economically when you had vast differences between places like Greece and Portugal and Spain and the northern parts such as Germany and Holland. It was bound to be a failure. But that is something that the elite in Brussels refuse point blank to accept. If you look at the Eurozone, people in Greece have been made destitute. I know people in Portugal who've been made destitute. I know people who've committed suicide. Spain, huge unemployment among its youthful population. There's an economist in Portugal who said that the euro had crucified the people. Yet, by all economic logic, it's a dysfunctional organisation, the Eurozone. All economists say, don't know why it continues, it's bound to fail, but it's continuing, and it's the triumph of politics over economics. Very interesting in universities over the next 5 or 10 years in the economics departments, how they unravel this mystery, where next week it's expected that the European Central Bank might actually print something like 4.3 trillion euros on quantitative easing, the production of funny money. But that, as far as they're concerned, is the political imperative. If they fail on the Eurozone, then you really can't move to the United States of Europe that Mr. Standring told me about many years ago. I think it's a foolish, very foolish policy, because even if we did create the organisation in their mind, ageing Europe, we have no great capacity for feeling the need outside a certain section of the establishment at Whitehall to engage in any great projection of military power in other parts of the world at all. And if you look at the EU contribution to NATO, inside what happened in Afghanistan, it was very patchy indeed. Some countries said to their troops, you don't go out after it gets dark, for example. There is one country which I shall not name because it upset people. When they were relieved by another country, we made sure that we weren't attacked, because money is a great currency here. So I don't believe, even if they create this United States of Europe, that they can project the kind of force and that people will go along with that kind of force in the future. Now this brings me to up-to-date. Country from the European Union. Access to the markets. Nothing more than that. If we can get Conservative members of Parliament down in London who have argued for the UK to leave the EU and become a member of EFTA. But if you're in EFTA, an organisation of small states, it would be a terrible imbalance to bring in 60 million. And you would lose all your influence. So I don't think that's on for the UK, because EFTA would have to agree, and I don't think they would agree. But for us, 5 million, oil producing, fish nation, same as Norway, I don't think there would be any great problem. And it came as a great surprise to me. I'm in the SNP, but not of it. It's a long time ago since I've been deputy leader. Great surprise to me that they actually didn't go and talk to EFTA, just to find out whether we would be acceptable or not and what the conditions might be, because that would give us a bargaining power with the EU. I think everybody knew that the EU was going to say you're not getting in. Now, I don't know what they'd have done after a yes vote, but certainly that was a good tactic for them to employ, because Spain was unhappy and Westminster was unhappy, so the best thing to say is you can't get in. And if we had had an alternative, say, okay, that's your problem, not ours, if you don't want us, fine, we'll go to EFTA. We didn't do that. We were therefore left with this door being slammed on us by the EU. Now I understand Brussels' problem. Brussels would have a problem with Spain. Brussels would have a problem in getting a new treaty, because it would have to be a new treaty to accommodate us. Some people would lose the number of MPs to accommodate us and all the rest. It's quite difficult for them to do that. But as I said earlier, they've always shown a political flexibility if required. And I thought what they're likely to do is give us, status that doesn't allow us to go to the Council of Ministers, but gives us some sort of status very like Turkey, special status where you can get access and all the rest of it. And in a sense that puts the problem out of the way. I suspect that might have been how they would tackle it. Now, what's the future? I'm hoping that we'll get another referendum very soon, because I'm running out of years, just for a start. And if we do, our relation to the EU, and also, by the way, our relation to NATO, these were areas which tied us up, our attitude to currency, for example, but I'm here tonight about the European Union. And I think we have to get ourselves into the position of saying, well, that's okay. You don't want us? We've elsewhere to go. Now, one or two of us in the run-up to the referendum tried to make contact with EFTA to have a proper discussion. But we had no standing. We were just, Gordon Wilson and I, for example, oh yeah, we used to be, but we aren't now, anything to do with the organisation in terms of university think tanks off. They would engage in discussions with them about how they would view a Scottish application to be in membership. And so, I'm hoping that I can't persuade the SNP, because my criticism of the SNP, and it might sound immodest, whereas, although I'm the architect of the original policy, I've been prepared to examine the European Union as it's developed, stage after stage after stage, from the point where everybody had a veto to today, where most of the stuff is majority voting. And the clear objective of the United States of Europe is now open, and everybody knows it's going to happen. I've been prepared to admit I've been wrong. I've been prepared to re-examine, but I find nothing in the attitude of the Scottish National Party which indicates they have ever revisited that policy since 1986, when we won it 8-1. I remember attending a Scotsman conference on foreign policy in an independent Scotland, and Fiona, who is the spokesman on behalf of the Scottish Government, gave a speech in which the essence was, we are pro-Europeans, unlike the Little Englanders south of the border, as though Europe had never changed, as if there were no problems inherent in that change that was taking place. And I think that's a fundamental error that party members actually have to address. We got 70,000 new members. The original 20,000 apparently didn't want to address it, but I'm hoping that among those 70,000 are those who are prepared to say to the leadership, formally with conference resolutions if necessary, we have to reassess our position in relation to the European Union. Because if we don't, we go into the next referendum, perhaps in 2017, with the European Union shackling us once again with a no. I hope I haven't bored you. Perhaps also unusual for a politician to admit he's wrong, but I have been wrong on this several times.
I'm very glad to say that Jim's accepting questions this evening, so ladies and gentlemen, any questions from the floor?
Yeah, Jim, I was just, the question of the European Union, is it not been sort of focused in because of the far right in England, because of UKIP? And I think that part of the position that I sensed before the referendum was to sort of disassociate with that. So it's kind of, we're playing with a double-edged sword here, I think, because there is that sort of complication. I understand, Tommy Sheridan, for example, and various others on the left in Scotland have said, look, with regards to trade unions and stuff like that, we really need to start thinking about what our position in Europe is, but at the same time, would you want to ally yourself with something like UKIP or, say, for example, the far right in the Tory party?
Well, we are where we are now.
Yeah.
I'm talking as a member of the SNP, if we had done our job properly, we would have been there before UKIP, south of the border, ever started their arguments about membership. Now we are where we are. UKIP's there. And certainly UKIP isn't going to knock me out of the intellectual circle. My position has been one that's developed before UKIP was ever born. And I have got no great problems if Nigel Farage said tomorrow morning, we don't want a United States of Europe, and I say, well, neither do I. I ain't got no problem saying that whatsoever.
No, I know that.
And I think it's political cowardice to move away. You say, oh, that whole arena is now only UKIP. And that's foolish in my view, because there are other aspects where we can be differentiated from UKIP. I mean, Scotland, for example, needs immigrants.
It does.
If you take the universities, we have people coming out of universities from foreign parts, many of whom would like to stay here. That's also a moral double-edged sword, by the way, because we're stealing from another country, but people have got entitlement, and we could do with them. And UKIP don't want them. If we had an Einstein here who said it was proved to be an Einstein and said, I want to stay here in Scotland or in the UK, UKIP would say, not in your life, out you go. And we're not like that. So we can quite easily differentiate ourselves. But we better start now, because south of the border, I think the elite down there have become so alienated from many, many people who they're not racist, but they're worried. And UKIP, has fashioned onto that. And if you've got a UKIP significant numbers in the Westminster Parliament, then that will become the dominant argument over time.
On that issue, it was quite interesting to see the way in which I think the Guardian on a poll yesterday, a couple of days ago, and it was welfare state among issues preoccupying English voters there. The welfare state is sitting at the top, and then immigration is sitting underneath it. So it's clearly a live issue at this general election.
But if intellectually the Scottish National Party says we are prepared to look critically at the European Union, and we are prepared intellectually to identify where we think it's gone wrong, and we're prepared to identify whether or not we believe it can change, and therefore there is an alternative for us. I think that would be a great help as we go into the referendum next time.
I hope so.
If we don't, you'll get the same thing. They won't let you in, and then you get uncertainty.
Yeah, I think that's created by the media, but that's...
Well, you play into their hands.
Yeah.
Question here.
Just another question on that point, in the immigration kind of factor. Scotland's biggest problem over the last century or so, 2 centuries, has been immigration. How would coming away from the EU affect our ability to bring in immigrants, particularly from Poland and other Eastern European countries, because we do need those immigrants?
Yeah. If we were members of EFTA, you have the same rules apply. I mean, the virtue for EFTA for me is that in certain areas like foreign policy and defence and in trade relations elsewhere, you're a sovereign power. Whereas in the EU, you're not a sovereign power. I mean, there's no chance of Britain being able to do a free trade agreement with India. But Norway can. Now, why can that happen? Because the EU negotiates as a single entity. And within those 28 states, there are huge vested interests. And there are huge vested interests in India. And they would clash. I'll give you an example from my own experience in the Arab world. Dubai and Bahrain are major producers of aluminium, very low cost, because the energy costs are much lower than they are in Europe. I don't know what positions now, but when I was doing the negotiations, there was a tariff barrier against their entry to Europe, because 12,500 French people were employed in the aluminium industry in France, and if the Bahrain and Dubai aluminium went in, they'd be out of a job. So up goes the barrier, nothing doing, very nice, and all the rest of it, but you're not getting in. Now that's going to happen between the EU and India. It's probably happening just now between the EU and the United States over this trade thing that they're engaged in. Small country like Norway doesn't pose any great problem to India's vested interests. Small country like Scotland, we wanted to do a free trade agreement with China. We don't threaten Chinese, anywhere at all. That would be one of the advantages of being a member of EFTA. But the open borders, the free movement of labour actually continues. It doesn't change. There's see when you come into passport control, and you'll see, the EU, and you'll see EEA. That's the European Economic Area, and that's the deal between the EFTA states and the EU. That now the EFTA, you actually have to accept a raft of EU policies as part and parcel of this tie-up with free entry. But you've got to balance that against the fact that you're much freer. Also, Norway, for example, is the biggest component in EFTA, is required to contribute to funds inside Brussels, just the same as we are. But Norway controls those funds. EFTA was required, and continues to be required, to provide development assistance, particularly to the Eastern European countries. But that Norwegian money does not go into the EU pot. It is controlled by Norway, with an office in Brussels, in a bilateral relationship with each of those states. That's a very profound difference between us being part of the EU and us being part of EFTA.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was great to hear all that. It seems to me that any parties or people on the left, however broadly defined, we're in this sort of position of being between a rock and a hard place. The rock, if you like, of everything that's loathsome about UKIP and the far right in relation to Europe and immigration. And the other side is the sort of unacceptable nature of the EU as it now is. Is there any evidence or desire or moves afoot for the parties of the left, social democratic or further to the left, coming together and trying to reconfigure a Europe, a EU, which would not play into the hands of UKIP and the far right parties? Because that's what seems desperately to be needed, and I never hear of this.
No, I can't find any of that at all. It's almost as if UKIP has frozen them intellectually. We cannot move. All we can say is UKIP bad. You don't get any idea from anybody at all that they might say, well, actually, UKIP are going up because there's a reason. Because a lot of people are unhappy with this European Union. For example, let's take the European Parliament. And many in here know every Scottish member MEP. You're alone. If you went out into the street, they would probably even know they even exist. Now, there's no democratic legitimacy if your representatives are unknown, who actually make no real contribution to Scottish political life. When did you last? Alan Smith, to be fair to Alan Smith, does in fact occasionally write. David Martin at one time was actually quite prolific in his writing on Europe. But taken as a body, they make no contribution to Scottish political life at all. So we have this very strange situation where the Labour Party, I don't know whether to say it's on the left now or not, to tell you the truth, because I always thought that New Labour really meant not Labour. And it's taken a long time for folk to twig that. Absolutely frozen in the face of UKIP. The Tories at 6s and 7s, in the face of UKIP. And I think you have to have the intellectual courage to go up and say, well, look, that's UKIP's point of view. It might appear to be that we agree with them in the criticism, but our criticism is different. We're after something that is entirely different. We want Scotland to be an integral part of Europe. But there are problems with this European Union as it has developed. There's an arrogance at the centre of Europe, which has to be challenged. If you look at what they've done in the Eurozone, you have to say that's arrogance taken to the nth degree. They are willing not only to crucify people, but bear in mind that the governments of Greece and Italy were changed at the diktat of the people in Brussels. And when I go to Portugal, my friends don't talk about the Portuguese government, they talk about the Troika. The Troika's coming to lay down the law. So that, you know, democracy has been overcome by a very, very high-flowing, absolutely almost fanatic elite in Brussels. And we shouldn't be afraid, because Farage can say that, why we shouldn't say that and come up with answers. It takes courage to do that. But right now, you know, the SNP is the same, Labour Party is the same, Tory Party is the same, Lib Dem's the same. They're not prepared to cast a critical eye on it and come up with ideas. I mean, they all say it doesn't work, we want change. What changes? I mean, the whole thing that Cameron really wants change is no free movement of people, which he's not going to get, by the way. That's impossible.
So how can you open up the debate and get that actually on the table to be discussed outside this room?
Well, I'm in retirement for the second time. You know, my influence in the SNP really is not very great. You have to understand the SNP. This is really worth looking at. When we didn't have a big parliamentary group, and there was only 4 of us at Westminster, the party organisation was all important. I mean, I had to stand, you know, for deputy leader, I had to stand for the national executive. When Saddam invaded Kuwait, I had to go to our national executive and get an agreement on what I was to say in Parliament. Now, I was all in favour of us pushing them out, but the executive, actually, when we started the conversation, weren't at all in favour of us engaging in war. And there was a whole morning where I sort of said to him, you know, I'm the foreign affairs spokesman, I've got to make a speech next week. And actually, the best I could get out of it, because the power lay with the national executive, was that we'd abstain. And when the debate came and I made this speech, and if I may say so, it was a very good speech because I knew what I was talking about, George Galloway torpedoed me in the last 3 seconds. George said, "How are you going to vote?" And after this speech, which was all about getting rid of Saddam, I had to say, abstain, you know, to great laughter. You know, what about a deflation, I can tell you. But the power lay in the party. As before 1945 in the Labour Party, power lay in the party. When Churchill wanted to continue the coalition until the defeat of Japan, there was a Labour Party conference on. And Attlee had to ask the national executive what the decision was, which they said no. Once 45 came and you had a huge parliamentary group which had to deal with the government and every day, power shifted from the party to the parliamentary party in Westminster. But the Labour Party at that time had enough sense to maintain the importance of the party, the conference and the national executive. That's what Tony Blair actually destroyed when he became the leader. You know, he just made sure that, you know, so the power lay on that side. The SNP in 1999 got a big parliamentary group. And suddenly power switched from the party to the parliamentary group. And the SNP leadership didn't have the wisdom to realise that you've actually got to maintain something significant for the party organisation and its supreme body, the national executive. If you look at the SNP constitution tonight, the important body is the national executive. But you go onto the SNP website and you try and find it. You don't know, and I don't know, who chairs the national executive because he's appointed by the leader. So what happens then in the SNP? You have the parliamentary party, big group for the first time. And what happens within that is the leadership takes control of policy. When the white paper was published, Margot was ill I went down to get her copy. And I'm standing beside an SNP member of the Scottish Parliament. And I said to him, you ken the difference between you and me? And it's no, because you're an MSP, by the way. The difference between you and me, we're both members of the party, but see, when I pick that up, I don't need to agree with it. You have to agree with every word. You have no alternative. You never made any contribution towards it. The backbenchers were never asked their opinion. There were no cabinet committees producing the white paper. It's a very, very tiny group that produced the white paper, which meant it had salient weaknesses because there wasn't a big wide circle of discussion that went on. The question for a party now with 90,000 members, can that imbalance between the parliamentary group, which means a very small group of leaders, and the party, can that be allowed to continue? So how do we get debate going? I think it's up to the members of the party, the rank and file of the party, to say we want a say in policy and we want a post-mortem. What went wrong? Because although we boast about being one of the 45, the fact of the matter is we lost. And there are reasons why we lost. Currency was one. The Fiscal Commission was more important than any member of the party. And yet we had people in the party who knew fine that a joint currency passed the initiative to George Osborne. All you need to say was no, and we had uncertainty from the very beginning. There was no examination of what we would do when it was evident the European Union would say no. That cannot be allowed to happen again. I know the SNP alone cannot deliver independence, but as is proved during the referendum, in the public eye it is the most important part of the Yes campaign. So really it's a challenge to the members. Are they prepared to say to the new leadership, we can't continue as we did, we want a better balance for the party? I mean, for example, I believe you could start balancing better if the cabinet met the national executive every 4 or 5 weeks for joint discussion. That would raise in the press eyes and in the public eyes the status of the national executive. And it might prompt people in the national executive to say, well, we've got 1 or 2 questions where we don't agree with you, we better have working parties established between the government and the party to look into issues such as I've talked about tonight.
We've got time for just one more question.
Speaking, just coming back to the EU, talking about the failure of the referendum, the failure to secure the vote, would you countenance the euro as a plan B? And if so, how do you think the public would have responded to it if it had been floated as a plan B?
No, I wouldn't. By the time we got to the referendum, I think it was pretty plain that the euro was a dysfunctional, Eurozone was a dysfunctional organisation in which power had actually gravitated to one single state. And we all know that Germany will determine next week whether there's quantitative easing from the central bank or not. I mean, it's not just because of a German hegemony. Germany's got a constitutional court which has put very strict limits on what the German government can actually agree to. No, if we had gone for a euro, I think there would have been panic among people because the euro is very, very easy to attack. And the virtue of sterling standing aside from the euro, I think the no side would have been able to score even more than it did against us. There is no difficulty in having your own currency. No, it's fiat currency, it's paper. There isn't a single currency in the world which has an intrinsic value. It's all, they've got psychological ones. Come in tonight with $1 million in Zimbabwe dollars for everybody and you wouldn't want them. Because psychologically, it's not worth the paper it's written on. And Singapore, Hong Kong, very good examples of how you set up your own single currency. I thought that would be a far, far better thing for us to do. I actually went and met Crawford Beveridge, who was the chairman of the Fiscal Commission. And I said to him, this is a political problem you've created for us. You'll have to have a plan B that you will quickly bring out. And you know, the plan B is a separate currency. And Crawford made the point that basically the Fiscal Commission put forward the recommendation, and it was either accepted or amended by the leadership, and the leadership was not prepared to amend it. And if we get into the post-mortem, we shouldn't enter the blame game, and I don't want to do that. But at the same time, we have to have the honesty to say, where did we make a mistake? At almost every meeting I was at, I had to explain why ALEC was technically correct, that it was in their interest to have a currency union. But if they said no, nothing you could do about it. We had to have the alternative, and then I had to spend time in explaining. But that was very difficult to take people along, because the currency union was the big thing. When Scottish Widows come out with their statement, this is going to cause us real problems and all the rest of it, I wrote to the Chief Executive of Scottish Widows and said, unlike others who are attacking you, I'm not, because I understand. Currency matters to you because almost 90% of your clients are external to the Scottish border. But what if we have a Scottish pound, which is 1-to-1 with sterling? I mean, you use that at the moment. All of us, if you go into your purse, your wallet just now, your Scots pounds, 1-to-1 with sterling. Would that create a problem for you? I mean, he wrote back and said, I don't enter these sort of hypotheticals. But I was just me. If in fact the First Minister had written to him, he couldn't brush him aside the way he could brush me aside. And that's where mistakes were in fact made that cannot be repeated. That's the message, that everybody did everything they did for the correct reasons, and if mistakes were made, they weren't made maliciously. And so it's not blaming anybody. I made mistakes, everybody made mistakes, but we have to have a sensible examination of where we went wrong on the yes side, and make sure that we sort that out. And one of the areas, as I've said tonight, is the European Union.
Just to that point, Jim, it's quite interesting actually you mentioned EFTA, because when I was at the SNP conference in 2012 and 2013, the EFTA were actually there. There was actually, in the fringe setups, the EFTA were actually there. Ian Hutchinson and Alan Smith were actually having debates, quite open debates with party members, with other members of EFTA. So
on the fringe. But it has to be in the central, it has to be inside the conference, it has to be inside the party, and policies have got to be taken. I mean, why wasn't the leadership asked, why aren't you talking to EFTA formally? So that we're armed when we go in and the EU says, you're not getting in, and say, well, we couldn't care less. We're off somewhere else, we've got it all fixed. So I think, you really it's a challenge for the membership. And if somebody says to me, oh, you're attacking the leadership of the SNP, that I'm not. Mistakes by the leadership are the fault of the party members. For far too long, the conference was a clap-in, where there was no real criticism of anything that was being done by the leadership. They were delighted that we were a big group in, they were delighted when we were a minority government, even more delighted when we were a majority government, and therefore, in my view, stopped thinking. And it's high time we all began thinking again.